Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Loot Drops. We're going to be talking about the historical franchise known as Diablo. We're going to be looking at the original, the sequel, Diablo 3, what went wrong there, and to the future at Diablo 4 right now.
You think me mad, old friend, but I know these dreams. They tell of the future. Hell is coming, brother. Hell is coming.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. Joining me is Paul Tassi and James Duggan. Thank you guys for making the time again, and for Paul staying up late. How late is it over there?
It's 11. It's fine.
It's 11.
Could be
So,
worse.
so full disclosure, I am definitely a casual Diablo fan. I understand why the franchise is great. I have enjoyed Diablo 3 a lot, but I'm going to be relying a lot on you guys to talk about it. We're going to be talking about the past and the future of the game. So let's get started. Why is this game so beloved? James, I know you're a big Diablo guy. So
stay a while. What is it?
What is it about Diablo that just people adore?
Well, I think it's really the root of a lot of the things that we love about ARPGs and even shared world shooters today. I think it can be traced back to Diablo, or at least the popularity of those elements can be traced back to Diablo. Things like inhabiting a specific archetype, going online, playing with friends as part of a party. Those motifs kind of transitioning into games like World of Warcraft and then eventually Destiny and stuff like that. And I think with Diablo 3 specifically, I think I'll say the design pillars were shifted, but I think a lot of those are kind of returning in Diablo 4. The other thing that I love about the Diablo universe and just the world is inhabiting this very dark, destitute space where it's very myopic. You don't really understand what's going on outside of the bounds of what you're able to perceive. And having this rich, combat-rich action RPG experience within that world with your friends is a very fun experience.
One thing I can definitely attest to is just your powers just feel awesome from the get-go, and you only get stronger as you go. It does an excellent job of conveying directly how loot empowers you or how your skills increase as you power up. You know, you sort of unlock your character's swath of abilities, and it just feels great. It feels great to be constantly powering up, getting your higher level tier gear, and going in that route of just average game leveling mechanics.
Yeah, that's one thing Diablo does really well that even games now still don't really emulate, like those big power spikes that, like, you know, you play Destiny, you go through the campaign or something, and like it kind of feels the same all the way through, and the leveling curves are very gradual, but Diablo, one drop can like randomly like triple your power or something, like up to a certain point, like maybe not in the ultra end game, but you feel like this kind of massive, you know, superhero almost from moment one, and then you only get stronger as you level up. And oddly, we can talk about this a little later, that's actually something I thought Anthem figured out to some degree as it went on, because it was learning those lessons from Diablo where you could kind of come up with those action-oriented builds to really kind of feel blatantly overpowered, and that's something that Diablo has kind of always leaned into. That's felt really good.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the initial question that we were going to talk about is looking back at the legacy of what Diablo was, and let's start with Diablo 1 and 2. Why were they so successful? What did they do that just kind of got them this cult following to fit with the thematics of the game?
I think Diablo 4 existed in a time where, Diablo 2 existed in a time where you were kind of limited in terms of your action RPG slash MMO choices. I think the prevailing MMOs of that period were things like Ultima Online. I guess it was a little bit, maybe a couple years earlier than Diablo 2, which came out in 2001, and then the Lord of Destruction expansion. But I think that what it really hit on was adventuring through this world with your friends, and then trading was a huge part of Diablo 2, kind of having an item economy. I played Diablo 2, I was 10 or 11 years old, for many dozens or hundreds of hours before I even realized there were unique items, which are kind of akin to like exotics in something like Destiny, and kind of going into a game and having somebody just kind of throw a bunch of them at you, giving them away because they were no longer useful to that player, was a really cool experience. Hunting down specific rune words like Breath of the Dying. There was for the time, a very interesting item chase. And you could really make a lot of different builds work because the way that gear worked was some gear, like charms or equipment, would grant you increased skill ranks in a certain skill. So you could really there was a huge breadth of build options. You weren't forced into these kind of archetypal roles, or even with Diablo 3, forced down these relatively rigid set structures about this build can work at a high level, or this build can't really, or this is better than this one. It was very much kind of open to interpretation, and the more time you spent perfecting the build that you chose, the stronger it would become, even if it wasn't necessarily super viable or optimal right from the get-go. And that hopefully is going to return in Diablo 4, which is exciting.
Paul, did you get to play the earlier games or no?
Yeah, I never played Diablo 1. I think I was just too young for it back when it was in existence, but I played a lot of Diablo 2 growing up, and much to my parents' dismay with the giant demon on the cover of the box. But I put hundreds and hundreds of hours into that, and for me it was the difference, I think, between being the ARPG and a regular RPG, because I'm not really generally an RPG guy. I played Pokemon as a kid, but that was kind of the extent of my RPG stuff. And when I would come across other MMOs or RPGs that are mostly like turn-based or more static combat, like that didn't really appeal to me. But then you get a game like Diablo where it's just hack and slash and just like carve stuff up, like that perfectly fit the kind of loop I wanted. And then it was also really the first game to introduce some sense of loot grinding. Like that wasn't really even a thing in other games I had played up until that point. So that really, why are you smiling, Destin?
We all know what Duggan's doing in the video.
What am I doing, man? Continue, please.
He's just slowly shrinking into that.
You're talking about the loot
that was
systems,
that was an excellent succinct description of what was enjoyable about Diablo 2, though. I appreciate that.
In Diablo 2, a lot of people latched on to the loot, it seems. So like there were coveted items, you could easily power up your friends and play together. So like, what was the end game of Diablo 2 back in the day?
It was wacky. It was Bale runs, and then the secret cow level. There were cow level runs. You'd go there to try and get items, actually common items that had a certain number of sockets that you could then socket these runes into. Bale runs, which is the final boss, you do that on hell difficulty and have somebody kind of like run you through. It was actually not very good in retrospect. It was like a lot of menial kind of boss grinding, but not a mechanically rich, fun boss experience. Like somebody else is going to kill this and I'm going to reap the rewards. So there was that aspirational aspect that I thought was really cool. And then the ultimate achievement in Diablo 2 was Uber Tristram, which was this kind of cryptic. That's another thing that I think is kind of quintessentially Diablo, is this very cryptic puzzle element that you have to combine a certain number of things in a Herodric cube, and it opens a portal, and you defeat a number of bosses, and that opens another portal to like this very, very mechanically difficult, or at least statistically difficult area.
Okay. And
for me, one of the endgame components that is not traditional, not on that list, was trading. And it was trading up to get the stuff you wanted. Like you would start with some like lower tier item, and then you'd go to all these different games and try and join and try and find, people that are looking for stuff. And then you trade up and trade up and trade up and trade up. And then there's your Zod room. And like, then you do for the next rune. And then you make a rune word thing after like, weeks of this. And like, it was goofy, but I'd never experienced anything like that in a game before. And I may have rage quit when I did that once and got a dupe Zod rune that disappeared in my inventory.
Oh my God, I have a good story too.
Yeah, that still bothers me. But
so there's this Shaco helmet, and it was like this very neon green leather cap. And this guy put it in, and all the stats are randomized, and it was really good. And I was like, wow, what do you want for it? And he's like, no, just whatever you got. So I gave him some like unique items. And he closed the window, and he's like, oops, sorry, I hit the close button, reopened it, and just put a regular leather helmet, but with a green gem in it. So it looked green. And he totally got me. And then he left. I was like, you
Oldest
you
trick in the
bastard.
book. There were
Yeah,
so
go
many
for
of
it.
those though. It was like the true enemies of the game was like the spammers and the bots and
Did you ever play the drop game? That's something completely unique to Diablo 2 that I don't think I've ever experienced since.
it sounds
Um,
familiar. I don't remember exactly the
so
process.
what it would work, how it would work is you get a bunch of players in town, and I've never experienced this. It was basically like gambling, but reactionary gambling. So you go around one at a time, and you all drop a really good item, and you all try and pick it up as quickly as possible. So like the guy who drops it has the advantage of knowing when he's going to drop it, or she, and so you can snag it. But sometimes you miss it. Sometimes you get somebody else's one. It was pretty fun. Something I wasted a lot of time doing.
So how long was it between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3? Like a decade or something crazy, right?
It was close, yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was more than a decade. It was 11 years, right? Because 2001, and then Diablo 2 came out like May 20th, May 21st, 2012.
So Diablo 3 comes out. It's perfect. The community has no complaints, and they're all really happy. No, in reality, Diablo 3 came out, and even before it released, people were concerned about the artistic direction, and then there was a lot of feedback of that initial drop. So what was wrong with it, you guys? Like, I guess, Paul, let's start with you.
Yeah.
And then we'll start with the James.
I mean, the artistic direction in the end, I thought was one of the least of its problems, especially as time went on and they kept adding darker and darker zones. But obviously, the problem at launch was the game didn't work. You still remember the error code to this day, error 37, and like it was the biggest launch like Blizzard had almost in a decade, essentially, and the game was just flat out non-functional. And then it's server issues. Like it was a pretty bad one. It was like a legendary server catastrophe. But even when you got past that, the game does some really weird things story-wise. It kills off Deckard Cain like immediately.
Whoa.
Like from some.
Just kidding.
I'm sorry. Is this
10-year-old spoilers.
Yeah, right. To some like butterfly chick boss that felt really weird. So people didn't really love the story, but then you would start playing and you'd be like, okay, like I'm getting drops. Like mechanically, it's fun, but the original drop rates were like, I think I played for 70 hours before I got my first legendary. And in the original state of the game, most legendaries were just like items with slightly better stats and unique names. Most of them didn't have anything special about them.
Worse stats in a lot of instances.
Yeah. Sometimes it was worse stats than like a rare item or something. And then the third factor, of course, was the auction house. And so since you couldn't find any good loot in the game, you'd be like, oh, here's this auction house, which is just literally page after page after page of people who actually got good drops and now want to sell them to you for either in-game gold or real money. And like the auction house was, the thing that plagued the game for, most of the first year. So that's a whole other topic. But those were the three, I think, major things that happened right at launch where everyone was like, what the hell is this?
Did he miss anything, Duggan?
I think I'm not sure if you covered this or not, but I think the other huge element there was just a distinct lack of interesting content. I think I remember I followed that development so closely with Jay Wilson, and I don't think, I don't want to single anybody out. I really don't. I think that all of his ideas were good in theory, just the execution didn't really hit. I think they were a lot of things they were concerned with ended up being the solution to the problems that that game initially had. Things like we don't want 5 viable builds per character. We want 5 million viable builds per character, and those aspirations didn't really manifest in the way that I think they wanted to. There was this big community push before Diablo 3 came out where the people were like, we want this game to be hard, man.
Oh
It
god,
be so
that.
difficult. And they made it so difficult, statistically difficult, not mechanically difficult. And that was the problem. Like there's an in the development, they were like, how are we going to make the end game? Well, the thing we're not going to do is make a 4th difficulty because that'd be fucking ridiculous. And sure enough, the thing they do is make a 4th difficulty called Inferno mode. And if you went in there as any kind of melee character, the only viable strategy was kiting, which is like hitting somebody from a far range, slowing them down and backing up as you do it. So if you were like a barbarian, which is what I played, you just get one shot because statistically you really couldn't hang. So in that environment, the kind of workflow became find these treasure goblins or chests, avoid killing enemies, get loot. So the loot grind in and of itself
break pots. Remember when you just broke all the pots and that was like the best way to farm?
So that's abysmal. Like Blizzard should know way better, especially since World of Warcraft was out for a number of years, and like that loot that item chase is phenomenal. So I also can't help but feel, and I still feel this way to this day, that there were in the Venn diagram of MMO and action RPG, right? You have World of Warcraft over here and you have Diablo over here. I think a lot of the things that made Diablo 2 interesting and unique and innovative got transitioned over into World of Warcraft, and kind of everything got put on steroids. I think David Brevik said something like this. Maybe he was a different Diablo 2 developer, but yeah, the World of Warcraft was kind of the Diablo 3. It took all the motifs, multiplayer action RPG, classes, challenging endgame content, and put all that stuff on steroids and made something great. Diablo 3 was then left with like, hey, what is this franchise? Is it just a bunch of clicking? That's what it is. It's a bunch of clicking. It's a bunch of clicking and like gore. Cool, let's ship it. And I think it really suffered from an identity crisis early on. With that said, playing through the normal difficulty, I did like a 48-hour stay up live stream where I beat the entire game in one sitting on hardcore. Wow. By the way, I was the only one who survived out of the 4 YouTubers at that time that I was working with. And so, yeah, I went through that Nightmare, Hell, Inferno. And so it was just replaying the same content 3 or 4 times.
You didn't really play for 48 hours straight, did you?
It was 24, 36, something. Like, who's counting? Anyway, it was a long time.
You're crazy.
I was like 22 when that game came out.
You were just a kid.
And so then once you really sink your teeth into the end game, you realize that there's no interesting loop there. There's no interesting gameplay opportunity. PvP isn't in the game. That was something that was at BlizzCon when they were showing it off, this arena mode that looked really cool, but ultimately that couldn't really work in the space. So there was nothing interesting to do at the end game. And then if you wanted to be powerful, you would just go to the auction house and spend literally like $3, and it would save you hundreds of hours of grinding. It was freaking ridiculous.
Yeah, the prices were like almost weirdly too low, because it's like it would save you that much time for like $1.50, and you're like, what? This is just negating the entire purpose of the game. And like there was no way. I think I get what they were trying to do, and to monetize the black market that always existed with Diablo, because people would be selling, Stones of Jordan and whatever in Diablo 2, and like they're like, oh well, we can fix that market and get a piece of the pie for ourselves. And then it destroyed the core loot feedback of the game. So farming was completely pointless, which is the entire point of the game. So the game was pretty much useless for 8 months or whatever it was, until right before Reaper of Souls.
So let's talk about Reaper of Souls. I think if you talk about Diablo 3 now, everybody talks about Reaper of Souls. They almost don't even remember launch. I'm sure there are people out there, but for the most part, it's regarded highly, and people really, really love Diablo. So what did they do that turned it around? This is a time when people are hoping Anthem turns their game around, and they're stoked when they see games like No Man's Sky manage to bring it back. So what did Diablo manage to do that has left a resounding positive amount of feedback from the community?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those stories where it's like there's only a few of those in video game history where you bring up the big comebacks, and it's kind of Reaper of Souls and Taken King in the same breath, and then like Final Fantasy Realm Reborn and No Man's Sky. Like those are the big switches. And in Diablo's case, there was a lot of stuff. There was Loot 2.0, where they did a big overhaul of all the loot. They made the drop rates better. They made loot more interesting, where it would actually change your builds significantly. So there was an actual loot chase. They got rid of the auction house, so that was not the easy button for loot farming anymore. They introduced adventure mode, where you could like replay any area in the game in any order and not have to like sit through story cutscenes and story dialogue and stuff. And then they had the Rift system, which is the procedural, infinitely increasing kind of difficulty thing. And then I don't know if it was in that update, but they revamped the end game difficulty modes at some point too, with torment levels. So it was a lot more scalable to base it on what you wanted to do there. So like there were just so many huge core fixes to it that it didn't like completely solve everything, and they kept iterating on it, but it was a total sea change from what it had been at launch. And I mean, it got everybody who was doubting it like either hooked back on it or trying it for the first time, and like that's how it became like such a huge selling game, was in the wake of that.
Yeah, I do think there's a diminishing returns factor, or a diminishing return on the fun factor. I think that a lot of the things that they did with Loot 2.0, the Greater Rift system, they were obviously huge improvements. And there's a really, really interesting GDC talk Josh Mascara did, who is the game director on Reaper of Souls, called Diablo 3 Decline and Rise or something like that, or maybe Reborn or whatever it was. But it was basically talking about, okay, what are the problems? How do we fix them? And they were very actionable, real answers, which was great. And it made for an excellent expansion and ultimately turned that game around pretty much 180 degrees. With that said, I still think there are a lot of problems, and I still think there is a massive, massive room for improvement. I think one of the prevailing criticisms and one of the prevailing concerns about Diablo 4 is really kind of people want to have a really fun part of the action RPG space, albeit somewhat tedious at times, is creating your own build that is very, very unique to you, something you dreamed up and something that you have now manifested in this character and making it work, even if it's not perfect or great. And I think the Diablo 3 legendary system is great. I love picking up something that fundamentally changes a skill and makes me want to use it. That's really cool. But when every single one of your items or, you know, the best in slot gear is very much these sets of, hey, this is going to be a whirlwind set. This is going to be a Hammer of the Ancients set. This is going to be a charge set. You run into that thing that I think Jay Wilson was trying to avoid in the initial Diablo 3 team, which was these rigid handful of builds that are kind of optimal for a character. But I think really when I think about, like, what do I want from the end game from the Diablo franchise, I guess two things pop into my mind. One is really mechanically interesting boss fights. I want to flex my skill, not just my build. I like greater rifts. They're challenging, they're fun, but at a certain point, you can only click a couple of buttons and everything dies on screen instantly, and it's, you know, fun for a certain amount of time, or you run up against statistical difficulty instead of mechanical difficulty. So that's, I think, my major criticism of Diablo 3's current state and just at the action RPG space in general, is I really want to be challenged mechanically instead of just statistically. There should definitely be an element of skill in the build process, but I really, really want to be challenged when it comes to the mechanics of the game and the bosses. Something like World of Warcraft or Destiny does an infinitely better job with that. And then I think the other big thing is I really want PvP. I am a firm believer that PvP in a game like Destiny or World of Warcraft or Diablo should be a place where you go to show people, make them feel how much time you've invested in this game. Take this really cool item and smash somebody's head off with it. I don't think it should be League of Legends. I don't think it should be a competitive shooter space. I feel like this should be a place where you go to flex your RPG muscle and show people how much of a boss and how much of a no-lifer you are. That's just my personal opinion, but to me, that is like the end game where it should be asymmetrical, it should be dynamic, and therefore that's why I'm really excited about this whole open world PvP thing in Diablo 4.
Paul, I got to ask, you're worried about it, it seems like. What are your concerns?
I don't want PvP. Honestly, I mean, like, I'm not familiar enough, I guess, with World of Warcraft PvP and how that works, but for me, I see a lot of problems with introducing PvP, because then you run into the kind of Destiny issue where you are always having to figure out the balance between, you know, PvE gear going into PvP. And what I think that does overall is it limits build diversity and limits the kind of insane power you can ramp yourself up to, because, like, you know, showing off of that endgame stuff and showing I'm the biggest, baddest no-life guy, that kind of means one thing in PvE, but it means something different in PvP. And like those builds wouldn't necessarily translate to each other. And so like in Destiny, it's okay because it's so much about mechanical skill, like most of the time when it comes to PvP, where it's like the build is not really what matters. Like, yeah, we have one-eyed mask and whatever, complain. But like, I'm worried about a Diablo game trying that, because I feel like unless they have some sort of crazy mechanical level up there where it is skill based and like they can balance that, I just worry it's going to dumb down gear and the power level and everything to be not as interesting as it could be if it was just focused on PvE. And I think we've seen good examples of games that have avoided PvP partially for that reason, whether it's Borderlands or Anthem. And they've done a good job with just going so crazy with some of the stuff they do in the PvE modes that you see franchises like Destiny complaining that they don't have that kind of stuff. Because like, yeah, you can never wear 5 exotics at a time in Destiny. not because that would, kill all PvE content, but it would make PvP unplayable. Like it's just stuff that gets hard limited by the inclusion of PvP. Whereas like I can see it, as a part of it, but for me personally, that is not. It's not only not an appeal. It's what I would worry about it affecting the part of the game I do want to play negatively. So I can't prove that'll happen, but that's just what I think.
Do you have any rebuttal, Duggan, or is it
Totally.
just kind of?
I think no. I think that's a super valid concern, and it's something that we've seen play out a couple of times. I absolutely think in Destiny, there are times when I feel like, oh, this is going to be so much cooler if there wasn't PvP in this game. Or I wish this worked differently in PvE than it did in PvP. And that's something that every single game since, I guess, World of Warcraft has kind of struggled with. With that said, when I think about the most fun I've had in PvP in an RPG or MMORPG, RPG, whatever, in terms of the progression and items that I'm interested in attaining and taking those into PvP, I think of classic World of Warcraft. I think that's where it really was kind of at its pinnacle. And replaying classic, that feeling is still there. If you see somebody on the opposing team in a battleground with Sulfurous Hand of Ragnaros, which is an item that takes 40 plus people, a collective total of who knows how many thousands of hours to get and craft, of course they're going to be more powerful. And when you get destroyed by an item like that takes so long and so much dedication to attain and teamwork to attain, it doesn't necessarily feel bad. It almost feels kind of cool. Like if you get hit with a Sulfurous Wind Fury proc and it essentially just one-shots you, you're like, what am I going to do? All right, well, we got to group up on that guy. I don't really know. It's definitely fun if you're the guy who's holding it. That's for sure.
It does give you something to aspire towards also. Like,
absolutely.
I want to get that someday. And that is something a lot of more modern games are suffering from currently.
So I agree with Paul in the sense that I think PvE should be, in terms of the priority of designing interesting items, PvE and the end game content, the cooperative content, should always be prioritized. You shouldn't make something less awesome. But I do think it can exist where maybe there are a couple of small compromises, but ultimately in the PvP space, I think should just be an unbalanced playground, especially if it's open world, especially if it's asymmetrical in the sense that there's going to be 4v1s. And in Diablo 4, they're definitely still trying to figure that out. And I think this is the core of the issue that is ultimately going to make that a very, very difficult thing to implement. But
is there PvP in Diablo 4? Have they said that outright? Okay.
Yes.
I
There
didn't
are
know that.
PvP zones. There's PvP in the trailer. You will be able to PvP against other players. I don't think, there's never been full loot except for some weird fringe cases in Diablo 2. But there are basically going to be specific zones that have PvP. And I think PvP is like, I used to think, hey, let's just do PvE and let's make the items as bonkers as possible, but there's nothing that replaces human opponents in any game. And I replaying WoW Classic and getting together with 4 other players to go do a dungeon and instead getting sidetracked into this epic open world PvP battle, that's so much more interesting to me. So it's a really important inclusion in my opinion.
So let's transition into Diablo 4. We've gotten a gameplay trailer, a cinematic trailer, and Duggan, correct me if I'm wrong, but you played it, right? You actually got to play it during BlizzCon?
3 times. So I played it for about it's like a 25-minute demo. So yeah, like an hour and a half.
Paul,
less.
Did you get a chance to? Were you at BlizzCon?
I have not played it. Nope.
So we have one person on the panel who played it. Paul, I'm sure you've been watching the coverage for Diablo 4 and talking about it. For me, just outside looking in, it looks fairly similar to Diablo 3. You have your health, you have your mana, you have your abilities. Graphically, it looks awesome. Like, I am stoked as a casual fan going into Diablo 4. What do I need to know, Duggan? What classes have you played? How do they feel? Tell us
all of them. Well, thankfully, I wrote up a little doc just in case somebody asked me this question. So let's go through it. I think let's just start at the beginning. And you essentially choose one of 3 classes. There are going to be 5 at launch. The 3 current classes are the Barbarian, the Sorceress or Sorcerer, and the Druid. And people are really excited about the Druid because we haven't seen the Druid since Diablo 2. There was some rumor that it was going to be a Diablo 3 DLC character a la the Necromancer, but ultimately was scrapped. And the Druid in Diablo 4 is really interesting. The kind of the druid and the barbarian. I don't think the sorcerer needed any refining. It's kind of the classic quintessential spellcaster. Honestly, it was the least interesting of the ones that I played, but still very fun to use. Like a lot of CC, a lot of ranged attacks, big explosions, fireballs, things like that. But let's talk about the barb and the druid. So the barbarian, since Diablo 2, has been a mainstay. And the barbarian in Diablo 4 is really interesting. They've kind of refined the class fantasy to include this new thing called the arsenal system, where instead of choosing a two-handed sword or maybe a two-handed mace or two one-handers, you just get all of them. And you keep them on your character at all times, and depending upon the skill you're using, the barbarian will dynamically swap to that item and kind of use it. So if you use something like Frenzy, he takes out his two one-handers and starts, smashing away. And if you use Skewer, which is kind of a bleed effect, he'll take his sword out and kind of like cut the dude's throat. It looks really cool. It's very fun thematically, and I think mechanically it's interesting because you can do things like give players a benefit for, hey, if you'll get 10% increased damage on a skill if it uses a different weapon than the one you hit last. So there's definitely some cool design possibility there. The druid has always been a really interesting concept in Blizzard games, either World of Warcraft or Diablo, but in practice it's been like, I'm a cat or I'm a bear. Or, you're just an animal because you specialize into that one thing and you stay in that form forever. Or I'm a tree. Where I think that the quintessential druid fantasy in any kind of fantasy is shape-shifting. And that's definitely what it is in Diablo 4. You're dynamically shape-shifting between this attack has you use werewolf, this attack transforms you into a werebear, this attack transforms you back into this kind of wizened sage-esque character. There's some really cool stuff in there. I picked up a legendary called Thunderspire that every time you shapeshift even into and out of human forms, it sends down a bolt of lightning to hit something. They have a really fun spell called Cataclysm, which is this big AoE. So I think thematically they're really finding their stride, but they kind of found their stride in Diablo 3. I don't think at any point the core combat in Diablo 3 was the problem or the class identity. I think they always kind of nailed that. So a lot of the stuff in terms of the mechanics, Destin, to your point, mechanically it looks and plays like Diablo 3. That's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But I think the spaces where it really, really innovates, it's a much darker tone, which is really important. Visually, it's darker. Oh, go ahead.
I have the gameplay going right now, and I did forget that they showed that just how your abilities are going to work better in tandem. It just seems like everything flows much better than it did in 3, and that's got me pretty stoked.
There's a really good flow to combat, and then I think that there are probably going to be a lot of interclass combos, which is a fun thing. I think the build that we played in the vertical slice isn't necessarily indicative of the build that you're going to be playing in the final game, because it's more of a smorgasbord. Let's see how many abilities we can fit onto a bar that are different, instead of like all your abilities stun people. So I guess the major innovations, the biggest thing is it is a shared world action RPG. And that works in different ways. If you're questing, you'll see just a few players. If you're in a public event, you'll see more players. If you were in a town, you'll see lots of players. And if you're fighting a public boss, like Ashava the Pestilent, which is this big undead demon that I counted like upwards of 12 players on screen, classic raid boss, you'll see quite a few. And then if you want a more private experience or you just want to play with your friends, that's something you can do, but only in instance dungeons and caves and things of that nature. There's some enhanced boss mechanics, lots of telegraphs, and stuns haven't historically worked on bosses in Diablo, but now there's a stun meter. And then there's going to be world PvP. Skill ranks are back in loot, which is a really big deal. There are no more ancient legendaries. There's a lessened emphasis on set items and a greater emphasis on personalized builds. And that does it for my notes.
Okay, I mean, looking at the gameplay, it looks great. I can't wait to get my hands on it. Even just as a casual fan, I think it's going to be pretty easy to market towards people, assuming that's the product that we end up getting. As we saw like this week with Warcraft 3 Reforged, there's a ton of stuff that was supposed to be in there that just isn't there, that they're even advertising on the website still. So that brings me to Paul's point that you wanted to talk about on the show. Is Blizzard up to developing and releasing a fantastic Diablo 4? There's been a lot of key figures who have departed, and the company's been struggling lately. Why don't you tell us about what's been going on?
I mean, I'm worried about it in that sense. Like, everything I've seen and heard from it, like everything he was just talking about, that all sounds amazing. And like, I have had no problems with what I've seen basically. Like it looks more like Diablo 2. If it still plays like Diablo 3, all that sounds great to me. I am concerned about a number of things, and that like I am wondering how much that vertical slice is going to resemble anything that we see in the future. Like if that to me, like I'm wondering if that was just specifically crafted for this exact kind of BlizzCon reveal, and then like the actual game is just like, because quotes came out after that describing it as like, oh guys, like this is still way far off. Like, that was just the first baby steps of this project. So like I don't know the timeline of this. Like it seems at least 3 to 4 more years away, which when Blizzard already hasn't made a game in 4 years or whatever it's been since Overwatch, like that's a long time. And so I'm wondering how much it is going to change from then to now. And like obviously this week alone we got the example of the Warcraft 3 remaster, and like I mean I would hope it wouldn't be that severe, but that's just been an utter catastrophe. And it does feel to me like Blizzard in general just has kind of been wandering in the desert a bit. Like Overwatch is a good game, like they have esports, they add characters, but like it seems like we're far away from the Blizzard that kind of ruled the world with StarCraft, Diablo, and Warcraft, and they're just mainly focused on Overwatch, and like everything else just kind of seems to be fading, whether that's Heroes of the Storm being almost non-existent, and then Hearthstone. And we was talking about Josh Mosquera and the David Brevik, and like, but none of those people, so far as we know, are around doing this. And like, yes, you might have new people that are talented and have learned the lessons from those games, but it's definitely not the same people. So I think the lead is from I can't remember his name right now, but he's from World of Warcraft. Yeah, so he that could be a good thing, but it's also someone who's he hasn't worked on the past games in that major of a capacity. So I'm curious about the team that is currently working on this, and I think they have great blueprints behind them. It's just that Blizzard has not done anything really in recent years to reassure me that like this is definitely going to like work and definitely be out anytime in the remotely near future and be definitely like what we just saw. Yeah. So like, pardon my skepticism, but I don't think that's unwarranted, kind of given the state of things right now. And like this also kind of reminds me of BioWare, where like these used to be these like big giants of like, I can't wait for the next BioWare game, the next Blizzard game, and now it's like are they gonna pull this off, or it's kind of more of an unknown.
People are worried,
and I have a lot of stake in this, because like, yeah, exactly. Like I have to be cautious because like I have so much riding on Diablo 4 being good because of how much I like the series, and if it's not, I'm just gonna like lose my mind. So I am concerned, but then again, I like everything I've seen. So how can it's a tough balance, but that does keep me up at night.
So with the recent things we've seen from Blizzard, Doug, in the Warcraft 3 controversy, we had the whole Blitzchung thing with the China and everything that happened recently. They've just been surrounded sort of in controversy for the last at least 6 months. Do you have any of the of the concerns that Paul's echoing right now with the state of where Blizzard is at and their ability to deliver on Diablo 4's promises?
Everything I played of Diablo 4 and saw of Diablo 4 at BlizzCon 2019, including doing an interview with Luis Braga, who struck me as a very competent, intelligent dude, I was blown away by. But with that said, vertical slices are much, much, much easier to execute on and create something interesting than a full game. And even just looking at the vertical slice through the lens of how is this going to work when the game comes out, something like a world boss is like, well, is that going to be rare? Is it going to be spawning every 5 minutes? Is there value to me killing it more than once? Is it really that mechanically challenging? Is it going to be more mechanically challenging than the things I'm doing in 900 hours into this game? There are just an infinite amount of questions about how things are going to work. And absolutely, I share those concerns. I think that this Diablo 4 felt like a breath of old Blizzard, and I hate that that's a thing, but it totally is. It wasn't watered down. There weren't concessions made to try and have mass appeal. It felt like somebody's passion project. And so I'm super hopeful, but with that said, it's absolutely best to proceed forward with an amount of healthy amount of skepticism. I also played Warcraft 3 Reforged the previous year and saw this really cool cutscene with Arthas and Uther kind of hashing it out in front of Stratholme, and we saw how that turned out.
Yeah.
So I don't really know what's going on with Blizzard. Like there's clearly something going on. 800 employees departed last year. I had an interview with J. Allen Brack. You can actually find that on IGN.com discussing this. And the prevailing thing that I kind of got from that interview was we want to kind of get back. Well, we want to get back to making the games that people love. I don't know why there are all these barriers in the way. I don't know if it's just so inflated with special interest or whatever or focus testing or what the bottleneck is here. But they've definitely been off their game. And a lot of the stuff that I'm excited about playing on the Blizzard launcher is Call of Duty Modern Warfare and Black Ops 4. So I agree. I absolutely agree with Paul. I think skepticism is the healthy approach. With that said, being a huge Diablo fan and playing Diablo 4 and just having it not be bad and instead be amazing, even if it was a vertical slice that was very easy to sell me on, it totally sold me on it, and I am excited.
The insanity of the Warcraft 3 Reforged thing is that you played that, so they have that's done. All they needed to do was put that where it was in the game. So at least you have one that's completely finished. Every part of that needed to happen was done. They couldn't implement it in this game that is...
Well, they chose not to, I think, because it would have meant that they had to do it for every other major cutscene. And basically every story...
They shouldn't have promised that.
It's true.
It still says on the website 4 hours of in-game, cutscenes.
Seriously?
It still says
and there's 0? Is that what...
Yeah.
There's so many... Yeah, playing like... WoW Classic, when you've iterated on a game so many times, getting back to this is exactly how it was. There's a certain art to that, and I can respect it. But very much the sentiment with Warcraft Reforged was this is not the classic version of the game. This is a remaster. We are updating this. We're going to make some balance changes. We're going to do things mechanically. That interview is also on IGN in text form. And so to me, the fact that there's no auto-saving, that you can't freaking customize your keybinds without editing a text file, that you can't disable subtitles. The HUD takes up a third of the screen and the subtitles take up the other 2/3. It's like, come on, guys, it's 2020. You are, at one point, you were the most elite developer on planet Earth for this kind of stuff. What's going on? So yeah, of course there are concerns. I would imagine Blizzard has their absolute A team on Diablo 4, but I don't know. I don't have any further insight on that.
That's everything we wanted to talk about tonight. Before I wrap up the show, is there any other points that you want to hit on, Paul?
I don't think so. I'm just hoping and praying it's good, but like this, I feel like we're going to have many, many more of these conversations because I think it's just going to be a slow trickle of stuff for years now. Like this just doesn't seem like it's going to be here anytime soon.
You have a ghost.
Ghost.
Yeah. What about you, Duggan? Any final thoughts?
I think I will say, I think even with Warcraft 3 Reforged, they're probably going to fix it. Like, Diablo 3 was in really tough shape. Goodbye, Paul. We miss you. I think that Blizzard does stand by its quality, even if it's been a little bit muddled recently. So even with Diablo 3 and probably with Warcraft 3 Reforged, I'd be so surprised if they didn't address that feedback. There wasn't a massive push. I wish they didn't release the game. I wish they instead, the darker side of the decline and rise of Diablo 3 for me has been, this is now standard practice industry wide, is ship a game early access or full launch. It's not where it needs to be. It's nowhere near where it needs to be. But guess what? It's going to get there over the next couple of years. And along the way, we're going to do all these limited time seasonal events and incentivize people to kind of play in a deficit even though they're not having fun. So I wish that games would come out and they would have those kinds of things sorted out, but that's just not, it's
not in this genre.
Yeah.
I can't. The Division 2 is like the only game I can maybe think of that like seemed to have like a really solid launch. That like everyone was kind of okay with, and then like 3 months later everyone was mad again, but at least right at launch it was pretty good.
I mean, for me, Duggan, you and I ran the raid. We went and did the raid, and the mechanics just, you brought this up in your Anthem review, right? Your mechanics have to work, and if they're just sort of stumbly at any point, players are out. And that's basically what happened with me. I was like, oh, the raid's not flawless, bye.
I have one more question I want to pose to both of you.
Yeah.
because I think with the action RPG space, specifically team-based, my favorite experience in Destiny, my favorite experience in World of Warcraft are the strikes in WoW, the dungeons, and the raids in both games.
Mhm.
Is there's an organizational element, there's a communication element, it's mechanically difficult. That to me is the meat of these types of games, and there's so much fat. I'm so surprised that there's still so much fat on these games.
Mhm.
Like, is not having an open world and just focusing on the stuff that you do best and you want to evoke. Not that I'm saying this pertains to Diablo 4 in any way, but would it be such a bad thing to have a World of Warcraft Dungeons, the video game, without the open world and all these other elements, and just really focus on what people want and dial exactly in on that and spending an enormous, astronomical amount of resources creating something that people ultimately kind of blow through and don't go back to?
Hmm.
What
Well, I
do you
don't
guys
I can
know.
see it.
Like, if you look at EA, they just made that Star Wars game, right? They're targeting now like 10 million in sales by the end of quarter 2, I think. So I think companies are coming back around to, you know what? What if we just made one game and we made it really well, even if that game's beaten in 20, 30 hours? Is that such a bad thing? No, because it still translates to sales and it translates to fanfare. And you can do it at a far reduced cost from bloating these games up in the way that we kind of have gotten since the launch of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, really. What about you, Paul? What do you think?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is kind of it would still be something you want to replay a bunch, like the individual strikes and dungeons and something, and not necessarily like a story game you just go through once. Like it would be like cutting
Yes.
out like patrol zones and things like that.
Exactly. Like I think
So
if you do a pie chart of all the time that I spend in a strike versus all the time that I spend in a specific area, the strike usually wins. The dungeon
I
usually wins.
the I think that sounds good in theory. The problem is when you say that, the one game that I think of that comes immediately to mind is Battleborn,
Yeah.
where Battleborn
Yeah.
was like it had
Good
like a
idea.
League
Maybe
of
not great
Legends type thing,
execution.
but it was also like strikes the game, and like
Yeah.
that was it. You would just like run these really long, kind of mechanically somewhat complex missions over and over, and like that didn't end up going very well. And like I don't know if that's the reason, but I mean, I could see it. I just in a game like Destiny, I really enjoy kind of there being a world, and like to me, it's more about just the mechanics of this strike or that raid. It's the world that exists in. Like, I don't think Last Wish would have been as good without all the Forsaken story content and Triangle Shore and Dreaming City and all that stuff. Like, I think they play off each other, and even if you are spending more time in one thing or the other, I think it's probably a good thing to have both. That said, in a game like Diablo, where we never really had an open shared world in these big sprawling zones, and that's been fine. Maybe you don't always need to invest in that, and I think there's kind of been a little bit of a pushback against these just stupidly huge open world games, either in this genre or others, but because they're just too big sometimes, and there is too much fat. But
yeah, look at Anthem. Its open world is sparse, and they couldn't even fill the space with regularly interesting stuff to do because they ran into technical problems. So maybe they tried to do too much, possibly with Anthem.
At
They
least in
tried
the
to
demo
be
in Diablo
Destiny.
4, thankfully, did not have that problem. There was a lot of really interesting stuff to do, a lot of public events.
Yeah.
They made a very good argument for here's why we have a world. I just
Mhm.
question that's the first thing that's implemented in any game like this. It just seems, I don't know. I think questions should be answered before it is. But Paul, I thought that was a really good point. Like that's good feedback.
Yeah, I mean, in any game like that, you start with your base and you build upon that once you got the base going well, I would imagine.
I think
Anyway.
the base should be mechanically interesting combat, Anthem,
Yeah.
or working telegraphs, and then you build the massive world after you
Yeah.
get that. Anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Paul, again for staying up late. Thank you, James, for coming on after your gym time.
Oh, so exhausted. I work out.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. If you watch live, I always play a game afterwards, so thank you for joining us. You can support the show at patreon.com/lootdrops, along with some other projects that I work on. And thank you. I'm going to sign off and say goodbye to these guys, and I'll be back live, or I will see you for the next episode, by the way, which will be about either Division or Borderlands 3. We're working on it. All right. See you soon. Bye.